What if you learned that everything that scientists have been saying about global warming is a lie? That's what my guest John Moore is saying, and what's more, he can prove it. A homicide detective and private investigator since 1973, Detective Moore was previously an intelligence analyst for the United States military. Using his combined skills and experience, he managed to track down and debrief witnesses to several U.S. Navy classified briefings regarding global warming. With shocking results, he'll explain how the government has known about climate change for decades and that Al Gore's message of stopping global warming has come 30 years too late. He'll tell us about the government cover-up, how he managed to discover this information, where the safe haven for rising ocean levels and climate change is, plus much, much more as we discuss the arrival of Planet X. As John Moore returns to Late Night in the Midlands, answers your questions, so please get ready to call in at 347-989-1012. Again, that is 347-989-1012. And everybody, please welcome my guest once again here on Late Night in the Midlands, Mr. John Moore. Thank you so much for being a guest here on Late Night in the Midlands, John. How are you tonight?
Thank you, Michael. It's very good to be with you again. How long has it been since we visited? About 6 months, isn't it? Around December or so?
Yes, sir, it has been. And Glenn Kennedy, you're with us as well. I just want to let you know my co-host tonight is Glenn Kennedy. So good evening to you too, Glenn.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi.
Well,
okay, yeah, it's been a while, John. It sure has.
Well, let's get this off to a running start here.
Okay.
Now, Glenn, have you had the opportunity to see my DVD, Global Warming: What the Government Isn't Telling You?
No, I have not. This is
okay.
a new subject
well,
for me.
Michael's holding out on you. He needs to get you a copy to watch it. That was recorded in front of a live audience in April '08. I had a conversation last night with a young man who's got I forget if it's a bachelor's or a master's in physics, very bright young man. And he says, John, what you said would happen in 2 years in the future, which was April '08, which would be 2 years in the future would be now. He says those things are now happening. And what I said, Glenn, that would happen 2 years in the future would be increased number and severity of seismic events, increased number and severity of volcanism, which, of course, we're seeing dramatic increases in both, aren't we?
That's right.
Yeah, right. Now, I'm no prophet. I don't have a crystal ball. And I'm no scientist. I'm a homicide detective. But I pay attention to the scientists, and I know some, and I listen to them, and I read what they write. And I also know, because I've read about what happened when this cycle went through. We went through this cycle 3,600 years ago. And that's why I was able to say with some certainty what would be happening in the future, 2 years in the future. Now, the federal government, gentlemen, has something called continuity of government contingency planning. It goes back to the Eisenhower administration in the Cold War days. Originally set up, obviously, to deal with nuclear war. But beginning in 1979, they changed course, and they were planning for the events that we're about to deal with in great sincerity, with what we generally call earth changes, which is abrupt climate change and rising ocean levels and seismic activity and volcanism, all kind of mixed in one kind of haphazard package. The original completion date, gentlemen, for them to be ready for all these events was December this year, 2010. About 5 years ago, they redid their calculations, and they discovered, oh my goodness, we don't have until December 2010. We need to move it one full calendar year closer to us in time to December 2009, which is what they did. And of course, they continue to make plans and do things. In fact, Michael, I think since the last time we've talked, we've found a couple of fascinating new tidbits. For example, in the summer of 2007, NASA, never a straight answer, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, they granted a $74 million contract to a Prudential subsidiary called Prudential Relocation, $74 million two-year contract to relocate NASA employees, ending in September 2009, renewable in one-year increments. Well, one of my research associates, Mr. Sheldon Day, I asked him to submit a FOIA request to get contract specifications on that contract, Freedom of Information Act request. Well, to make a long story short, by the time the government was done and by the time Prudential Relocation was done redacting, which is a polite way of saying censoring, all we had was a couple of sheets of paper with mostly blacked out words. You really couldn't make heads or tails of it. What we were looking for was two things, actually three things. How many people were being relocated, where they were being relocated from, and where they're being relocated to. Now, where they're being relocated from, well, you don't have to guess about that because there aren't many options, and they're all fairly close to oceans. Kennedy Space Center, Huntsville, Alabama, and Houston, Texas. That's pretty well known and not a secret. What we don't know is where they're going to. Truth of consequences, Mexico is one place NASA owns, but we don't know how big it is or if it can accept those people. Or maybe they're going to Denver, like the CIA and NSA.
Right.
So there's some unknowns there. Anyway, we also learned this past fall that NASA is building a massive computer center 20 miles south of Salt Lake City, out in the desert. And I've been 20 miles south of Salt Lake City, gentlemen, and it really is the desert. They have sandstorm. I was in a sandstorm. I had to walk backwards at about a 55-degree angle so I could walk and keep the sand out of my nose and mouth and eyes. Anyway, yeah, that's the desert. Now they're moving from Fort Meade, Maryland, of course, and here's the publicly stated reason. May make sense if you don't know how the national power grid works, but they say the local power grid can no longer provide enough electricity for the 20 acres of Cray mainframe computers underground at Fort Meade, Maryland, which is kind of laughable because most of us know that the power grid is no longer local. It's nationwide in scope, and the power grid in Maryland can buy electricity from Texas or New York or any place there's electricity to be bought. So that's obviously a fraud being perpetrated there, and it's obviously they're moving these people and all this equipment for no reason that makes any sense publicly.
Well, it might make a little sense, at least to them.
Well, it does, and it's very disruptive. You know, these men and women who work there at Fort Meade, they have families, friends, all their connections, children going to school. It's incredibly disruptive to move people 2,000 miles away from everything they know and want to be around. And it's nothing to be taken lightly.
So they've been planning. Oh, go ahead, Glenn.
I was just wondering if they even have facilities for that many, schools and everything else that they would need to relocate that many families.
Well, they're going to do it, and whatever infrastructure is there, the local community will have to deal with it. Probably public schools will. I've seen this before. They'll bring in portable buildings to house extra students. They'll do whatever they need to do. Because they have a mandate to accept all students that live in the district. That's, of course, the case any place in the country. I got some more information about the Plum Island Animal Research Facility. Michael, I think we talked about that the last time.
Yes, sir.
Well, we have new listeners. This is radio, of course. Now, Glenn, if you and I were going to study and work with really fun stuff like foot-and-mouth disease and anthrax, wouldn't we put it on an island in the Atlantic Ocean? Would that be a smart thing to do you think?
You definitely want it away from as many people as you can, for sure.
And away from agriculture. Well, that's what they did. They've got Plum Island off the coast of New York up there, and for about 50 years they've been studying those very deadly diseases and organisms up there on Plum Island, which is about 200 acres. Now, you can do a Google image search. You can find Plum Island aerial photos and topographical maps in about 0.3 of a second. on Google Image, you know. And here's the publicly stated reason why they're moving it to, guess what, Kansas, you know, the most productive agricultural real estate on the planet. They say, quote unquote, we're running out of space on Plum Island. Well, do your Google image search of Plum Island, and you'll see a few little black dots in amongst about 200 acres of real estate on that island. There is no shortage of real estate there, gentlemen. They could triple or quadruple the amount of buildings on Plum Island and still have enough space for 2 or 3 golf courses.
Amazing.
Well, it is, and it's right in plain sight. And that's one of the, Michael will remember this. I go into some detail in my DVD about hiding things in plain sight.
Oh, yes.
This is a prime example of that, gentlemen, because most people won't go the trouble of questioning it. They'll just accept it as fact. Oh, they're running out of space on Plum Island. It must be some small spot, not enough space. And well, that's a good thing. They need more space. Until you look at the aerial photographs, and then it just blows their whole story out of the water. The EPA still has all 4 of their libraries closed down, by the way, gentlemen. And when they did this in the summer of '07, I think it was, it caused the scientists who work there to file grievances. It's sort of like suing your employer, Glenn, you know, not really career enhancing, filing grievances against the people who write your paycheck. Well, that's what well, God bless them. You know, these men and women, these scientists, they did the right thing. And they said, gentlemen, you've cut us off from the basic research material we need to keep America safe. The EPA responded, well, we closed all 4 of these libraries as a cost savings measure. And then God bless them, the GSA, the government, or GAO, excuse me, Government Accountability Office, they come along and say, no, gentlemen, it costs more to close these 4 libraries than to keep them open. Yes, this is a deep hole of convoluted cover stories. Right. Cover stories on top of cover stories. I had out somebody sent me a map a couple of years ago showing all the FEMA camps circled all over the United States. I was pulling out looking at it, and I thought, oh, I hadn't thought about it before, but out of the dozens and dozens of FEMA camps, there's maybe 5 or 6 that are close to a major body of water, the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf Coast, or the West Coast. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, of course this fits. They know what's coming. They're not going to build FEMA camps that are going to be underwater, so they put them away from the coastlines.
Absolutely.
You're speechless, gentlemen.
Yeah, absolutely, because
not good for a radio talk show host.
No, not good at all.
Well, one of the things I'm finding out, I'm starting to emphasize this more and more, is the cyclical nature of this event that we're at the beginning of, and most important of all, drum roll please, the cyclical nature of human beings living on this planet. There's been a lot of attention, I think intentionally so, about, say for example, that claims that UFOs with alien beings came to this planet and gave us our civilization, or helped build the pyramids, or some silly stuff like that. I think the reason those stories are promoted and given attention is to keep the theory of evolution alive, because according to the theory of evolution, once you go back, say 50,000 years or 100,000 years, our ancestors would have been knuckle-dragging primitive people without speech, certainly without written language, when the facts prove exactly the opposite. When you get into a study called forbidden archaeology or hidden archaeology, you start running across artifacts that would, and do, in fact, throw Darwin's theory of evolution standard on its head. Human footprints in the same fossilized mud as dinosaur footprints, for example. Or how about a human shoe print in solid rock? And the mainstream scientists will say, oh, it's nature creating a artifact that looks like a man-made object, until you take a 10-power jeweler's loop and look carefully at the footprint, the shoe print in solid rock, and you can see the threads and the stitching.
Now, do you think that they're going to actually get away with this cover-up for very much longer? I mean, I can't see where that eventually we're going to be able to see this object in the sky, aren't we? And
well, we will, Michael. We will, Michael. And by the time we can see it, this whole planet's going. We think it's rocking and rolling now. It'll be rocking and rolling to a point where, yes, many millions of people will know what they're looking at and what this thing means. But by then, it will be way too late to do very much of any consequence in terms of escape from low-lying areas and really having safe havens that have food and medical supplies and so forth. We'll be down to the final few weeks, if not few months by then.
We have had several earthquakes around the world as it is, and and then the volcanoes and so many other things. I mean, sinkholes, giant sinkholes at that. And I kind of wonder if that doesn't have something to do with all this.
Well, I was talking to one of my research associates today about the sinkhole in Guatemala City. That's not necessarily related. Apparently, Guatemala City was built on volcanic ash, which is very subject to water erosion, which could be quite natural and not necessarily related to any of this. Unless, of course, if you're living in Guatemala City, it's pretty damn important because that whole city is honeycombed. Yeah, it's honeycombed with these tunnels made by water washing out the volcanic ash that the city's built on. That's a very unfortunate thing for those folks, but I don't believe it's related to any of this. I don't have any evidence of that. But you're right, Michael. The first, we're wrapping up half a year here in about 3 weeks. The first 5 months of this year, I was referring to, by about the 4th or 5th week, the earthquake of the week, because that's what 2010 has been, the earthquake of the week. I've seen more major, destructive, life-taking earthquakes this year than I had probably the combined 2 or 3 years before, and everybody has been paying attention. Now, earthquakes can be caused by a number of things, and people want to talk about the government agencies doing it, and with Tesla technology, they can, but, I can't imagine what motive they would have to make things worse, because it hurts them also, and they don't want things to get worse any quicker than necessary, because disruptions in commerce and so forth hurt them also in what they're trying to accomplish. But earthquakes can be caused by gravitational pull from other planets. It can be electrically triggered by massive electrical discharges through the solar system. And of course, these plates, they do move and create earthquakes periodically for no reason that anybody can tell why. But we've had more of them this year than probably the combined 2 or 3 years before. And I believe, gentlemen, this will continue. Both the seismic activity and the volcanism will continue to be more frequent and more severe. Now, I live very near the New Madrid seismic zone myself. The FEMA maps put me outside by maybe 50 miles, the worst area of destruction. We'll still have infrastructure damage here, and I know that, and all the elected and appointed officials know that. But in my particular area, in my county, I don't think we're going to take any life-threatening destruction. But around the New Madrid seismic zone, FEMA has been very busy for the last several years, posting posters in public places and educating all the sheriffs and the paramedics and the firemen and the police officers about what will happen. Not a matter of if, it is a matter of when, and when is getting very close in time, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, and we're getting predictions of one of the more active hurricane seasons too. We're being told over on this end of the, I'm in South Carolina, obviously, and they're getting us prepared. They're saying that this is going to be one of the more active hurricane seasons. Now, do you see these hurricanes maybe? I was told once by one guest, who you're probably familiar with, Dr. Wren, that they
I've interviewed him. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he's talked about how they've changed the scale. So we might get a higher hurricane, maybe a 6 or 7, and they'll just say it was maybe a 5. Do you see
Well,
that
they'll
kind
do
of
that.
thing?
They'll do that. Well, we're seeing it with we're seeing it right now with earthquakes, Michael. Now, the U.S. Geological Survey has a website that lists earthquakes, and the posting the earthquakes is in an automated system. So, say an earthquake happens, say a 3.5 in, say, Miami, Florida, at 2 o'clock in the morning. That'll be posted in by an automated fashion. The next morning, however, the USGS might remove it entirely or downgrade it to a 2.5 or a 1.8. When human beings that have a political agenda get to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, have their cup of coffee, and they routinely do this. They both remove earthquakes altogether, and they downgrade earthquakes on a daily basis.
Even with their lying, though, aren't if you look at it over the last 20 years, isn't it just kind of going up logarithmically almost? Isn't the
well, they have. And Glenn, there's another part to this you may not be aware of. You've probably heard of the Richter scale, haven't you?
Right. It's 10 times every point, 10 times magnitude or whatever.
Well, every 1/10 of a increase doubles the strength of the earthquake. The Richter scale developed by Charles F. Richter. After Mr. Richter died in the 1984-1985 time frame, Glenn, the Richter scale was reduced by one full number value. So, if you look at the USGS site, anything of 5.0 and larger is in red numbers. If it's 4.9 and lower, it's in black.
Yeah.
Now, if they were still using the original Richter scale, guess what? The number of earthquakes in red would almost double, because then they would include everything that's now a 4.0 and larger under the original Richter scale. And they knew, they being NASA and and USGS and the powers that be, they knew 25, 26 years ago, Glenn, what would be happening 26 years in the future, which is now. They knew there would be increased number and severity of earthquakes, and they knew enough people, educated people, understood the Richter scale, and they wanted to keep these people not quite as scared as they would be if they had the original Richter scale in place. So they reduced it by one full number value to keep people in the dark as long as possible. Going to Michael's question, how long will the cover-up last?
Yep.
Well, they own the media. They control the media. I was on Fox News nationwide, gentlemen, talking about terrorism twice shortly after 9/11/01. I got to know this young female producer up there in New York City with Fox News. We did a show about terrorism, and we'd talk about a concept for another show. We did that, and we talked about a concept for doing a third one. And I said to her, well, let's get serious about this. You know, we've kind of been dancing around this topic. Let's talk about this next show. Let's talk about the feel-good, make-believe security at these airports. So she said, okay, John, I'll talk to my boss. I'll get back with you tomorrow. So she talks to her boss. She gets back with him the next day, and she says, John, I'm sorry, we can't do that. So the answer to your question, Michael, is the powers that be are very, very effective at keeping a lid on things they don't want to get out. They really are.
Now, who all knows about this? Does it go to the extent of the president, or is he left in the dark about this too? And I wonder about also the Vatican.
Well, every U.S. senator knows about this and other serious matters that are highly classified. Of course, the president knows. He was probably briefed within. Of course, he was a U.S. senator before he became president, so he probably already had prior knowledge coming out of the U.S. Senate. Now, these men and women who are congressmen, U.S. representatives, they may or may not know. Until they've been there 3 or more cycles, they're generally treated as temporary help and not really let in on the inside, unless they develop a friendship with somebody who tells them. Now, the Vatican is a fascinating thing. The same summer that the EPA closed all 4 of their libraries, the Vatican closed their library, which had been open every working day for 6 centuries. Allegedly, because of a structural problem, in the main library building, which, by the way, was only about 20-something years old, which is pretty new in a location where there's many buildings 2,000 years old. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I know.
You know where they're
But it remains closed. The Vatican Library remains closed. The Vatican is probably moved that priceless collection of documents, books, manuscripts to a vault in the Swiss Alps or some other similar safe location at a high altitude. The Vatican itself may be relocating. It's Rome and the Vatican is fairly far from the Mediterranean Ocean, but it's only about 90 feet above sea level. And it's probably, I don't know where they're going, but most likely a safe haven in the Swiss Alps would be a good guess. Some similar high altitude where they can have a safe, secure spot for all their people.
Okay, Glenn?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the Vatican Library because we had talked about that before, and yeah, definitely the cover story there is very weak.
Yeah, now I think since you and I talked, Michael and Glenn, there was a mainstream news article about a 1,000,000-volume library in England being closed.
Yes.
Wow.
And instead of renting retail or commercial space to move the library to downtown, in the same proximity of the building that needs to be rehabbed, and it's a beautiful round building with 4 stories, 5 stories tall. They're moving all the books, the collection, which includes a number of documents that are 500-600 years old, to a salt mine. Now, that tells me a lot. Now, once again, hiding things in plain sight.
Yeah.
Now, I frequently think about logistics. The logistics of moving books across the street or a block away to rented commercial space compared to the logistics of moving it to a salt mine miles away. But that's what they're doing, and they're probably, there was have both of you seen the film 2012?
Oh yeah.
Yes, sir, I have.
Okay. Well, first of all, the first few minutes, my black Lincoln Town Car was the hero of the movie. I don't have the stretch version. I got the standard wheelbase, but there's a scene near the beginning where priceless works of art in the Louvre, the French art museum, are being replaced by fakes, and the priceless works of art are being moved to vaults in a safe haven. That's probably actually happening. Very likely that is already happened. And that's the kind of thing I would expect to happen, is for the powers that be attempt to preserve civilization, attempt to preserve art, to have safe havens for people that have the skills that they will need to start over and rebuild civilization. I expect all those things have happened and are happening right now.
See, now, 2012, that movie, I thought, there was a lot of reality in it, but then I thought there was a lot of Hollywood in it as well.
Oh, sure.
As far as California just kind of sinking in the ocean, I don't know if that's going to happen, is it?
Well, the Navy says it'll take water damage from flooding. One of the disadvantages I had, Michael and Glenn, when I was debriefing these Navy veterans, and since there's so many of them here where I live in the Ozark Mountains, I'm always bumping into new ones. And in fact, we'll talk about the California thing, and I'll come back to the Navy veterans.
Okay.
The San Andreas Fault actually could split and have a sinking action. That is a possibility, and I've heard from fairly reliable sources that a lot of large portions of Southern California are honeycombed with the ocean going inland under the dry land for some miles. Right. So there is certainly some risk there. In California, Southern California is certainly at risk of massive tidal waves causing a lot of death and destruction, even if the part of the land doesn't slide off into the ocean like it did in that film. But there is a new thing since we talked last. One of my Navy submarine witnesses has agreed to go public with me, Mr. Tim Spencer, and I interviewed him on video in a studio about 5-6 weeks ago, and we're doing a video that's going to be coming out in the not too distant future with him on there being interviewed and talking.
Oh, good.
About
I'm going to want to see that.
Well, I'll be getting you a copy, Michael. I'll be getting you a copy.
Thank you.
Can you give us a few tidbit?
Well, Tim has a special situation. See, all these other submarine veterans have a pension that could be at risk if they talk about classified information that they know. Tim Spencer is a whole different situation. When he was assigned to his first nuclear submarine with 2 other men, they were told, gentlemen, we don't have bunks for you. We're going to assign you hammocks to string between the Polaris missile warheads. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. There's no radiation. Well, it turns out 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, all 3 of them are being radiated.
Jesus.
So Tim Spencer has 100% disability. They can't take that away from him. He has multiple health problems related to being poisoned by nuclear radiation. And he has no fear. They've taken everything from him but his life. And he has no fear, and he went public with me. He does some radio shows with me, and he's, like I say, he's going to be in this new video with me.
Oh, great. I'm looking forward to seeing that. You know, and I want to touch on the other fiction that I found in that movie, and that was at the end when the government actually opened doors and said, yes, let everybody in with us. You know.
Well, actually, the heroes stopped the doors from closing, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yes, they did.
So it wasn't necessary. It was not necessarily any kind of magnanimous gesture on their part. They couldn't close the damn doors.
Well, I got a
yeah, that was good. I mean, it was the special effects were very dramatic and you know, showing waves washing over the Himalayan mountains. Well, that's happened. You know, you can find artifacts from the ocean in the highest parts of the Himalayan mountains. You can go to the American Southwest, those big flat rocks we call mesas, and you can find seashells on top of them. I do a lot of private consultation work, and I was down in Texas 2 weeks ago, halfway between Dallas and Houston. And my client's riding me out to his home where he's building his safe haven. Before I even get out of the door, I'm sitting in the front seat next to my client, and his wife's sitting behind me. I look down on the ground, it's all sand. And I say to my client, this used to be the bottom of the ocean. And his wife says, oh, no. I said, well, yeah, this is sand. This isn't dirt. You don't have sand. You don't have dirt here. This is the bottom of the ocean at one time. But I have any number. You know, I do a Sunday show with live call-ins, Michael, and I've had any number of people call me from Texas. You know, say, John, I'm 80 miles from the ocean. There's seashells in my backyard. You know.
Yeah, you know, here in South Carolina, it's all sand, and I say that too. That this place had to have been at the bottom of the ocean at some point.
Well, of course it was.
I would think that if it was before, it will again. You know.
Well, of course it was. I mean,
what about
what
about these deep underground bases, John? You know, if the elites and let me ask your opinion on this as well. I mean, you know, in the movies like I think it was Sudden Impact, they made it seem like, oh, you know, every so many people there's going to be a national lottery and they're gonna win their golden ticket to go down in these shelters and so forth.
Right,
my reality is nobody's getting the golden ticket except for the elites. But question number one, these deep underground bases, if the water is going to come up that high, isn't it just going to find its way into those and just be underwater tombs? And secondly, how high do you think you'd have to be to even survive?
A couple of good questions there, Glenn. First of all, I know people who have access. They have their golden tickets if they wanted to, and they don't trust the engineering, and they're not going.
Really?
In any structure, whether you're building a tree house as a 10-year-old or you're building something like this, any structure has an engineering premise as to what it can do, what it can withstand in terms of forces You know, the kids' treehouse would be built to hold up so many children, for example. The engineering premise of these deep underground military bases, well, the main premises would be dealing with water and dealing with seismic activity.
Yeah.
So the engineer would be given a set of parameters saying, we want this to withstand a 9.0, or we want it to withstand a 9.5, or whatever it might be. And an engineer can engineer the concrete and the steel to withstand a certain level of seismic activity. If it goes a couple of points above that, you know, if it goes from a 9.5 to 9.6, that's double the energy. And if it goes to a 9.7, that's double again. Well, at some point, it's going to fail. If the earthquake exceeds the engineering premise by too much, the structure is going to fail. Now, they have ways of dealing with water. When the tunnels are made, they use a nuclear-powered machine that makes glass-lined walls, and they'll have pumps, the same pumps that are used in these coal mines and deep underground mines. They can pump tremendous volumes of water very, very fast. And of course, the premise there is that the pumps will work. There'll be redundancy. You know, they got all the money in the world, our money, to have backups on the backups on the backups. And
sure.
And one of the reasons they didn't build, if you notice, they didn't build one underground base. They built dozens of underground bases, and that's more redundancy. They do understand, and they probably have planned for losing some of these bases.
Right.
So they're not going to have all their brain surgeons in one deep underground base. They're not going to have all their metallurgists in one, or all their physics people, or all the people who know how to do welding. They were going to have people with all the skills that you can imagine, a massive brain trust of people from all disciplines and all walks of life, people who can repair the Ford diesel pickups and people that can build new F-15s. You know, everything you can imagine has been accounted for, and they will bring these people into their shelters. One of the ways they built these things and kept it quiet was to use the cover story of Superfund cleanup sites.
Yeah.
You know, you can, if you're a congressman, Glenn, and you've got a toxic thing in your district, in your congressional district, or you're told that there is, whether there is or not, your attitude is, well, Mr. Department of Energy, spend as much money as you need, take as long as you need to take, get that stuff out of my congressional district. And that's what they did. They did that all over the country, using Superfund cleanup sites as bottomless pits of unaccountable money for the following reason. So let's take nuclear waste, for example, Glenn and Michael.
Okay.
Almost nobody understands the technology of what it takes to clean up nuclear waste. Almost nobody knows how long it takes to do it. And most important of all, how much money it costs. Cost is not even a consideration. Go ahead.
John, aren't we kind of brushing our teeth with that stuff? If I remember the video that I have of yours, you actually compared it to chemicals that you would find in like bug killers and pesticides.
Well, that's a different story. Yeah, the sodium fluoride is poison, and that's why. And I did this on a radio show a number of years ago. When I started out in St. Louis, I said, ladies and gentlemen, go to your medicine cabinet, pull out your toothpaste, and look at the back of it. You'll see a warning that if you swallow the toothpaste, to call poison control. I had some lady, she was appeared to be an older woman, maybe in her 70s. She called up 20 minutes later, and she says, John, I did what you said, and it's exactly what you said. If I swallow the toothpaste, call poison control.
Yeah. And
it actually says if you swallow more than the amount used for brushing, call poison control immediately.
Precisely.
If I remember correctly. Yeah.
Precisely.
Go ahead, Glenn.
I was just going to say that they actually just changed the wording on it because Alex Jones had just bought some recent toothpaste to read it on the air. It used to say, it swallowed more than a pea-sized amount. Now they
Right.
changed the wording on both brands that he had that says if you swallow more than an amount used for brushing, like just mind control. You know what I'm saying? It's like, what does that mean? You know what I mean? It's
there's another part of this. First of all, children can't read, and second of all, they make children's toothpaste taste like candy.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You know, they do. It tastes like candy, and it's what we're doing to we're literally poisoning and killing. The German swim team won't compete in American swimming pools.
Really?
They don't want exposure to the poison called chlorine. They know better.
Yeah.
And the largest organ in your body, gentlemen, is your skin.
Absolutely.
And skin can and will absorb chemicals. And if you get in the water, it's got chlorine in it, guess what? You're absorbing a very dangerous and deadly poison called chlorine.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We're killing ourselves.
And this is stuff that a lot of people don't know either, and it's just one more example of how the government covers up so much. And now I want to get back onto this Planet X thing. Do we know exactly where it's located right now?
Well, we being you and I and the general public don't. It's south. If you're in the Antarctic, you can probably see it. Even being in the Antarctic, there's only a few months a year when you can really see it.
Wow.
Coming up from the south. Now, there's other imaging devices, satellites, for example, like it was first seen by the Pioneer 10 space probe 31 years ago. They've been tracking it with every kind of imaging device you can think, in the visible light spectrum, the infrared light spectrum, radar, everything you can imagine. They've been tracking this object for 31 years. And of course, NASA and the powers that be know precisely where it is and are keeping very careful track of it. You know, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth visited the Goddard NASA Space Flight Institute when she was in the United States a couple of years ago. I think it was 3 springs ago, because of her sudden interest in matters related to space. But what happened, gentlemen, was she was briefed. She got a first-hand briefing from the scientists there about the 10th planet.
Okay. And so now, oh, go ahead, Glenn.
I was just going to say, but they always called it Planet X, but you believe it's a brown dwarf as well?
Well, I defer to Professor McCanney, and he doesn't regard it as a brown dwarf. The science part of it, and this is another part of what I was alluding to earlier, one of my main sources of information has been these Navy veterans at these briefings. That's problematic because they were in the folding chairs in the audience. They weren't the scientists being, up there doing the presentation. They were told what would happen. They were not told why it would happen. They weren't even told about Planet X at all. All they were told about was basically rising ocean levels. They weren't told about a pole shift. They weren't told about Planet X. They weren't told about abrupt climate change. The Navy's focus was, well, I guess we shouldn't be surprised, water. But that's enough right there. The rising ocean levels by itself is enough. As to whether the 10th planet is a brown dwarf, whether it can support life as we know it, are there beings riding on this thing? Maybe, maybe not. Quite frankly, I don't dwell on those things. I'm not really terribly concerned about them. We have enough on our plate that I can verify from reliable sources without getting into esoteric matters that I regard as not terribly important. What's important about the 10th planet is its size and its density. Whether it's a brown dwarf or not is kind of a secondary issue.
How big is it?
Well, let me quote from Professor Harrington. Now, there's a video, and Michael, I don't know if you got this one, Are We Alone in the Universe by Zachariah Sitchin?
No, sir, I did not.
Okay, well, I saw that on my website, but it was done about 20 years ago, and it features a 10-minute interview. Now, I'm going to tell you who the person is, Dr. Robert Harrington. Now, Glenn, if you're going to draw a paycheck every 2 weeks for looking at stars, how's this for credentials and getting a paycheck? Supervising astronomer of the United States Naval Observatory, being interviewed in his office at the United States Naval Observatory.
Huh.
He doesn't have anywhere else to go in his career path upward. The only place left for him is retirement. He may get some kind of honorary chair as a guest lecturer at some university, but he's at the top of his career path when he gave this interview. And he talked about the 10th planet, and he said its size was 3 to 5 times the size of Earth, and it had a far larger iron-nickel core, making the dense core a lot larger than the core of Earth, giving it a lot more bang for its buck, so to speak, when it came to gravitational effects. He described its orbit as being an elliptical orbit, very similar to the one outlined by the Babylonians on the clay tablets that were interpreted by Zecharia Sitchin. So that's some of the most powerful evidence from a source that is impeccable, Dr. Robert Harrington, in his office at the United States Naval Observatory.
Yeah, that is definitely a great resume.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I guess.
Now, go ahead, Glenn.
I was just going to say, I guess, so, it's like a moon tidal thing times whatever. It's like, the moon pulls on the Earth ocean so much and rises and falls, but this thing's so massive. I guess it all depends on how close it comes in this swing around.
Well, you're on the right track there, Glenn. Now, the moon is only 250,000 miles from Earth, and it's fairly small compared to Earth.
Right.
A fairly small rock. And look, how many millions of tons of water does it move every 24 hours on this planet? And Professor McCanny calls this action at a distance. Now, the 10th planet is much, much larger than our moon and has a far denser and larger iron-nickel core. So it could be a lot farther away. It could be, say, 1 million miles away and have a lot more impact on us than our moon does from 250,000 miles away, just as an example. In addition, my private sources tell me that the 10th planet has a 250,000 mile wide debris field. I'll say that fast 10 times, on either side of it. Rocks. A debris field is rocks.
Yeah.
And that adds more pucker factor here because there's certainly some chance that some of these rocks the size of Cadillacs, rocks the size of Rhode Island, could strike planet Earth. Hopefully they'll be the smaller ones. And
as it's said in the Bible, fire and brim will fall from the sky. I wonder if that's what they were referring to.
Well, a rock moving 1,000 miles an hour will certainly be on fire. Absolutely. Yeah. Once it hits that oxygen, it'll be on fire. Okay. We're finding meteor craters. I found in my county I live in. Because of modern satellite imaging and so forth, we're finding meteor craters we didn't know existed before. There's one in my county I live in here in Missouri, 12 miles wide. I've been to meteor crater in Arizona, and I thought, boy, that's really big, But a 12-mile wide meteor crater. It turns out there's a string of these meteor craters going from the southwest towards the northeast, almost in a straight line. Very large meteor craters, miles across.
Wow.
I don't know if there's been any attempt. There probably has been an attempt to date these things. There probably are ways to do that, but I'm not privy to that. But our planet has been hit by rocks a lot in the past. Because we have vegetation and because we have so much water, a lot of these meteor strikes aren't even visible. Without the kind of sophisticated imaging that we have now, they're not anyway.
Right. Now, what's the plan with the nuclear facilities, the nuclear weapons? I mean, when all this goes down, there's another concern that we have.
Yeah, nuclear.
The powers that be share those concerns. They don't want our planet to be a nuclear wasteland any more than you and I do. And they're fairly good. I don't want to give them too much credit because I read Marchenko's books about penetrating these nuclear weapon storage facilities. But they do a fairly good job at securing these weapons now, and I would hope and I believe that there is a contingency plan to secure all nuclear devices and nuclear material before things get totally out of control, and hopefully they will just outright seize stuff from places like Pakistan and any other third world country that may have, like, I guess I would call India a third world country, that have nuclear weapons so that they're secured for centuries to come. Because last time this happened, we got smacked down into the mud and really didn't recover for many centuries in terms of any kind of sophisticated technology.
Yeah, I was just going to say that basically that would be a good warning sign if you see all these ships coming in for refits or whatever, because they would have to remove the cores, I would think, out of these submarines and everything else, because otherwise they're going to be busted up all over the, these.
Oh yeah.
Good point. A good point, Glenn. Yeah, good point. Ships of war would probably be the last things they would do, however, because they wouldn't want to give up any defense until the very last minute. I don't know what their contingencies are to get these cores out of these nuclear-powered ships, but I'm sure they have them. I'm sure there's protocols in place to disable these ships, take the nuclear material out of them, and put them in what they consider to be a safe and secure area that will survive all these events. 200-mile-an-hour winds, 9 and 10-point earthquakes, tidal waves maybe 1,000 feet and taller. We're looking at a pretty dramatic string of events here.
And if it affects Earth, then it's probably going to affect other planets and maybe even our own sun. And somebody brings up a good point about solar flares.
Absolutely. Well, coronal mass ejections, solar flares, have happened in the past. The last really, really big one happened, about the only electronic devices we had was telegraph. And telegraph offices caught on fire from a coronal mass ejection. Yeah. Now, of course, it's a whole different thing. Anything that has solid-state circuitry in it is certainly at risk. Older radios with vacuum tubes, if they aren't connected to the power grid, would probably survive. Any modern electronic devices that were in what we call a Faraday box, which could be an ammunition can, for example, a metal ammunition can, or maybe a nice, clean, galvanized steel trash can with a tight-fitting lid, would be a Faraday box, and that would protect it. But the chances are that our power grid, well, first of all, a coronal mass ejection solar flare could heat up whatever half. The planet's 24,000 miles in diameter. Half the planet will be unlucky enough to be facing it, the other half won't be. It will heat up that half facing it for anywhere from 1 to 2 hours, up to about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Wow. Which, you can survive that. I routinely sit for an hour at a time in a sauna at 150 degrees. But infants and older people with heart conditions, things like that, it'll just flat kill them. Any grass plants like wheat and corn and things like that will be wiped out on that half the planet facing the sun. All our modern electronic devices facing the sun, when that happens, would be toasted and may or may not recover and be usable again. Sometimes it's a short-term thing, and the device can recover its ability to work, and sometimes they won't. It depends on how strong the flare is and what kind of shielding there may be, even if it's haphazard, not even intentional shielding between the device and the energy, the source of energy being the sun. So there's a CME, a coronal mass ejection, is certainly part of the program, unfortunately. A pole shift is part of the program also. I'm hoping and praying it's only maybe a 18 or 20 degree pole shift. If it's a 90 degree pole shift, it will wipe out tremendous millions of people. 180 degree pole shift, it'll wipe out 95% of the people on the planet. These tidal waves would be 1,000 feet and higher if we had a 180 degree pole shift. Well, there's evidence for that, and we just talked about it, gentlemen. You know, seashells on top of mesas in Arizona. This has happened before.
Yeah.
Now, there may be insiders who know with more precision what's going to happen. I'm not one of those insiders. I get the information I can get, and I get it out public. And there's other sources for tidal waves. Say that all that rock and dirt in the Canary Islands is facing us. Juan de Fuca, I think it's called.
Right.
Yeah. If that breaks loose, that could wipe out the east coast of the United States with one massive tidal wave, all by itself.
Well, these people with the golden tickets that you've talked to, or I guess you said you knew at least one of them, were they ever told, have you, of all your research, were you ever given any kind of a time frame about?
Well, the only time frame I had with any precision, Glenn, was the completion date for all their serious work, which was December 31st, 2009 as a completion date. They continue to do their work. I'm having dates thrown at me that I can't talk about publicly, Glenn, because until I can verify something through sources that I personally know and trust, I don't believe it's wise to do so.
Right.
However, given the nature of how severe these events are, I'll quote from Professor McCanney. What are you going to do if somebody gives you a date? Buy another case of tuna fish? I mean, seriously, you know, America, it's part of our culture. We want to have a date. This December 12th, and one of the things I like about Professor Rand, or Dr. Rand, is he didn't get caught up in this December 21st, 2012 mania. I've read his book. I've interviewed him. That doesn't appear in his book, and God bless him for doing so. A number of serious researchers, Professor McCanney, myself included, we don't feel we've got until 2012. We really don't.
Well, even in the movie 2012, didn't it actually hit before, you know, and kind of came early?
Right, it did.
And many times, we know the elites many times like to you know, put things in movies. It's their sick way of saying, well, we told you. So, you know, a lot of times they'll put real things in movies.
Absolutely. So, and that's one of the reasons, Glenn, I encourage people to watch Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, because there is some science in there along with the fabricated science fiction.
Yeah. The
science in Al Gore's movie is what will happen in the future, rising ocean levels and abrupt climate change. That's true. That's verifiable.
But he blames us.
He does. Well, that's a science fiction.
Yeah.
You know, cow flatulence, SUV emissions, you and I, Glenn, and you and I and Michael breathing out CO2. The CO2 is good for plants.
Yeah.
That's what plants, you know. Yeah. When I was in grade school, they taught me that the plants take in our CO2 and give off oxygen. It sounds like a win-win situation to me. But that's the science fiction, is that we're creating the problem. No, that is absolute science fiction. The other science fiction in the film is the timeline they give. They say although they don't use 2016, they say 10 years in the future. The movie came out in 2006. They say 10 years in the future, things will start to get bad. And about the middle of the century, once again without naming a year, around 2050, things will really get bad. Now, the nature of Americans is, if it's very far out in terms of years, they're not going to do anything about it. You know, it's not going to be paid attention to. And that's the purpose of this 2012 date. We know because of what happened with the Y2K situation. We know that most people, if they're given a date of January 1st, 2000, they would not do anything before January 1999. And that's exactly what happened. And that's what the government wants. They want people to keep going to work, paying their mortgage, and watching professional sports. That's what they want, and that's what they're going to get.
Yeah.
The percentage of people listening to you and I, Michael and Glenn, is a tiny fraction of the adults in this country. Yeah. Right. If it's 3%, I'd be shocked. I'd be absolutely shocked. If 3% of the adults in this country listen to alternative news outlets like the one we're working on tonight, and if that can continue, and I'm sure that it will continue, The government will be able to keep a lid on this thing up until the moment people see the waves of the ocean coming at them.
Yeah.
Well, sure. So 2012 is just a way of making sure we're not prepared. And,
Absolutely.
I mean, the ultimate goal is to wipe out a good percentage of the population.
Well, there's two parts to this. Ultimately, well, I'm sure you've probably, if you interviewed anybody about the Georgia Guidestones.
No, actually, I haven't.
Okay. Well, you may want to look into that. But what their ultimate goal is 500 million people living on this planet, and the other, whatever it would be, 5.5 billion people dead. That's their ultimate goal. When it comes to 2012 date, they have two goals in mind. One is to keep everybody going to work and the infrastructure functioning, because a disrupted infrastructure causes problems for them also, and they don't want problems. So they want everybody going to work, UPS, big brown trucks delivering finished merchandise and goods to them as well as to everybody else up until the last minute, because there's always last-minute preparations, always more logistical things that need to be addressed. So they want things to be normal just as long as possible. And they also want people, they're not so much concerned about people getting prepared, they're more concerned about people going to work every Monday morning. That's their real concern. These people are going to die anyway. They're not concerned about that. But they want people going to work so that the infrastructure and normal commerce can take place.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I've always felt that there's a plan behind all this, and, you know, I just wonder how they're going to handle it when people do see this thing up in the sky and panic and, you know, and riot might break out. You know, do they plan on being safe from all that?
They do. These shelters are incredibly secure. They'll have U.S. Marines, you know, Army to protect them, and they'll be quite safe. You don't go up against men who have the kind of weaponry that the U.S. Infantry and U.S. Marines have. You simply don't do that. So they'll be quite safe in their little hidey holes. And at the beginning of these events, they probably will have martial law of some sort to maintain order. Towards the end, it won't matter anymore, of course. And the people enforcing martial law just simply won't go to work anymore once things get bad enough, because they won't be in the shelters, and they're going to be taking care of their own families.
Right. Well, there's actually a few things I want to touch on here, but I wanted to start out before I talk about safe havens, if there is any. I want to talk about, now in your video, I remember you speaking of a map that shows what it's going to look like after this all happens. So I guess my question is about certain areas, coastlines on the East Coast. I know a lot of listeners are concerned about their state, so I guess we can start with any one of them.
Well, let's do that. Let's do a verbal map, starting at Maine and working our way around the coast of the United States.
Okay.
Now, once again, I need to remind people, this is not John Moore saying this. This is this is from the U.S. Navy classified map. The U.S. Navy says that the East Coast, Gulf Coast, and West Coast will take damage up to 400 feet above sea level. That's pretty minimal. That's a kind of an entry-level scenario for what could happen. It could be a lot worse. So with Google Earth, you can go around the coastline, and you can see where 400 feet is from the coast. Typically 80 to 100 miles from the coast, depending on where you are. The farther north you are on the East Coast, the shorter distance that is, because you get higher elevations more quickly. The farther south you go, by the time you're in Washington, D.C., you're coming 80 to 100 miles inland. In fact, the Navy says the East Coast will take damage up to the Blue Ridge Parkway. Now, the Blue Ridge Parkway is a scenic route on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains running north-south, and it's typically 80 to 100 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. Now, we're looking at what states there? Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, all taking damage 80 to 100 miles inland, which just happens to be where almost everyone lives. two-thirds to three-quarters of the people in the United States live within 80 to 100 miles of the East Coast, West Coast, and Gulf Coast. Now, going down to Florida, Florida's going to be pretty much wiped out. The part that juts out into the ocean is going to be almost all underwater, is what the Navy says. Part of the Panhandle may not be underwater, but that's a big maybe. Going along the Gulf Coast area, you've got Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, all of which will take a lot of damage, especially Mississippi and Louisiana, which have low-lying areas going inland for way more than 100 miles. Alabama will take damage up to Huntsville, which is quite a distance from the Gulf of Mexico. Texas will take damage 80 to 100 miles inland. And you've got Mexico, which will have the same thing happen to it, of course. In California, it's a bit of a different story. You reach higher altitudes much more quickly in Southern California. You're going all the way up to Seattle. You don't take damage very far inland because you get higher elevations much more quickly. But once again, gentlemen, look at Los Angeles, for example. You've got, 15 million people living in metropolitan Los Angeles. That's going to be wiped out. It's going to be underwater. San Francisco, not quite so bad because you get higher altitudes fairly quickly. But part of all this is going to be all the ports where ocean-going cargo vessels load and offload both finished product and raw materials. That's all going to be wiped out. It's going to be gone. It's going to be underwater. Seattle is at great risk because so much of it is low-lying and right at sea level or just above sea level, which happens to be where my daughter and her family lives. But they're up in a suburb, I think high enough to be safe, at least initially, and I'll be relocating down here to the safe haven where I live. Now, what these men were told in these briefings, gentlemen, is that the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks is one of the known safe havens for the following reasons. First of all, distance from major bodies of water. We've got two states between us and the Gulf of Mexico. Altitude. The low parts of the Ozarks are 800 feet above sea level. The higher parts are around 1,500 feet above sea level. Distance from major population centers. There's no large cities in the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks. There simply aren't. You've got city of St. Louis, 2.5 million people, a couple-hour drive from the Ozarks. Kansas City, Missouri, another couple-of-hour drive from the Ozarks. Memphis, across Mississippi, a couple-hour drive from the Ozarks. A very homogeneous population, almost all WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Very few people of other races, other cultures. They're here, but in very tiny amounts. A fairly long growing season, fairly mild winter, at least for the time being. If there's a pole shift, there's going to be a new equator, and we're probably going to get a new climate. I don't know how you can estimate where the pole is going to go, except by looking at where magnetic north is moving. Magnetic north is moving toward Siberia, so that's where we expect true north to be moving toward Siberia also, which will give us a warmer climate here. And that's a mixed bag in terms of advantages and disadvantages. You get a longer growing season on one hand, but it's not as healthy to be in a hot climate. It's easier for all kinds of bugs to live and grow and prosper. So that's why the Arkansas, Missouri Ozark was designated as one of the known safe havens, was for those reasons.
Now, what about earthquakes and such? I mean, are you going to be affected by that?
Oh, we will. The New Madrid seismic zone is just outside the Ozarks on the Mississippi River, very near Tennessee and Illinois. Yes, earthquakes, well, here's what's going to happen with these earthquakes. First of all, Mississippi River, I didn't mention that when I did my little verbal map there. Mississippi River will be 50 to 100 miles wide and 100 to 200 feet deep, all the way from the Gulf of Mexico up to Chicago. And there's a possibility that the Great Lakes will merge, according to the Navy, The Great Lakes will merge to become one Great Lake, stretching all the way to Hudson Bay. Now, without exception, every briefing, these men were told that most of Wisconsin will be underwater. Without exception, that's what these men were told. The weight of the water on the new Madrid seismic zone, according to the U.S. Navy, will trigger at least 3 9-point-plus earthquakes. The country, gentlemen, will be split east-west at the Mississippi River. In fact, United States Northern Command, also called U.S. Northcom, is already being split east-west at the Mississippi River. They aren't telling these men why. A friend of mine who's in the Army, he says, well, John, if I didn't know you, I wouldn't know why myself. But it's much easier in terms of logistics to split these men, all their equipment, and all their supplies east-west at the Mississippi now, as opposed to after the fact. You know, there'll be you don't have bridges across rivers 50 miles wide. And you have ferries.
No, you don't.
Yeah, you have ferries, but it's just like, you know, making a trip across the ocean, going 50 miles on a ferry. That's incredibly disruptive. And so U.S. Northcom is doing the right thing, and they're splitting the country east-west at the Mississippi River for their own purposes. All their commands, you know, are being split east-west.
Now, I want to take a call in a second, but before I do that, what about Lake Ontario and even the Finger Lakes? I mean, these places such as cities in New York State like Rochester, are they going to be affected by the lakes as well? I mean, is this all?
Oh, absolutely. Here's what happens, Michael. First of all, it will be it's going to cause these oceans to come out of their basins, and the Great Lakes are basically inland seas. What's going to cause these oceans to come out of their basins will be a pole shift. Now, I mentioned this in my DVD, and for those who don't know, sea level is measured at Cornwall, England, and it's been that way for 200 plus years. Going south from Cornwall, England to the equator, once you get within 1,000 miles or so of the equator, there's a bulge of water not quite 500 feet above that horizontal line in Cornwall, England.
Wow.
That bulge of water is tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cubic miles of water above what we call sea level, held in place by two things, the rotation of the Earth and gravity. Anything that disrupts the rotation of the Earth by more than 2 or 3 degrees is going to disrupt all that water. That's where the water is going to come from, gentlemen. And it won't be just the oceans. These Great Lakes, these inland seas will be affected also. And that the technical term is slosh. Like walking across a room with a really big punch, like a punch bowl full of punch, trying to walk across the room. It's going to slosh. And
so New York will basically look like islands then. You know, there'll be some.
Well, that's certainly a possibility. In fact, the U.S. Navy told these men that the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks could become a series of islands. That's what they were told. You know, there's more bridges in the state of Missouri than in any state in the United States. We have so many creeks and rivers down here. It's hundreds of creeks and rivers and thousands of little dams going across, bridges going across these little creeks and rivers.
Yeah, I was actually looking at a map just a couple of days ago, and I noticed all the water, the lakes, the rivers, and the dams and all that, you know, and I just thought, wow, it's going to be nasty. It really is. So I'd like to take a call. We have Crystal from South Carolina. You are on Late Night in the Midlands.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome.
Mr. Moore, I'm curious to know, and I'm thinking it's really not going to matter much, but after Planet X passes us, where is it heading after that?
Well, it loops around our sun and then comes past us again. That whole thing takes the better part of a year.
So it'll be passing us again?
Right, and it may or may not be closer to us, depending on where it was the first time and where we are the second time. Yeah, so it's a double whammy, right.
Oh, boy.
Wow.
So are we to expect the same happenings again when it passes us for a second time?
Well, like I say, it depends on, you know, on where we are. We may be closer to it, we may be farther away from it. You know, the likelihood of being the same distance both times is pretty remote.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome,
All right,
Crystal.
thank you, Crystal. All right, so yeah, interesting question. Everyone, the number is 347-989-1012. We have about 40 minutes to go here. If you want to call in, you have a question. So yeah, you know, I was told that this thing was actually coming around the sun, and by actually, I think it was Dr. Rand who had mentioned that. And he also, you know, this Hubble telescope, that's the question I had about the picture that it took just recently. It showed a planet being engulfed by sun. Now, I wondered if that wasn't Planet X that it caught, maybe coming away from the sun, because it actually looked like it was coming away from the sun.
Well, the Hubble telescope has been looking at this thing for basically ever since it went up. But you're not going to, those images are not going to be put out publicly. That's simply not going to be allowed. The public will be kept in the dark from any real imaging from the Planet X by any government imaging device, whether it's a Hubble or the Pioneer 10 space probe or whatever it might be. That's not going to be allowed, Michael.
Now, how many other countries know about this?
Well, what is there, 130 countries or so on the planet, something like that? Well, these guys, you know, they all go to conferences. They know each other. They all go buddy up there at the United Nations. It's hard to say. It really is. And chances are, you know, if the president of Zimbabwe, for example, has stolen enough money, he can buy a golden ticket for himself.
Yeah.
Sure,
and leave
sure.
the rest of his barefoot peasants, you know, to fend for themselves and die. Right.
Now, in the movie, it actually showed the president and government officials, the importance, if you will, in like these big floating structures. Now, do you think they have anything like that? Because I don't think I'd feel too safe under the ground myself.
I really doubt it. I really doubt it. I think that was all Hollywood, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Now there are some incredibly large ships being built in the private sector for wealthy people to live on, and buy a condo for $1 million up.
Kind of like a modern day Noah's Ark, huh?
Well, kind of, sort of. I wouldn't trust the technology. You know, one of those things exposed to a 100-foot wave or a 200-mile-an-hour wind, I wouldn't want to trust them at all. No way.
Well, one of my listeners wanted to know about Montana, what to expect there.
Well, if it wasn't for Yellowstone, Montana would be a wonderful place to be.
That's what I thought.
Yellowstone, in fact, the government, and I don't know, you know, not every scientist knows everything, but the Navy was designating an area of Wyoming and Montana, a state line, that area as being safe. Way too close to Yellowstone to suit me. Way too close.
Yeah, I think so too. I believe in the movie there was that guy who was broadcasting there in the van. Isn't that where he was? Right over.
Oh yeah, the hippie. The hippie.
Yeah.
The hippie was, yeah. Yeah, that was kind of comic relief there, wasn't it?
Yes,
yeah, he was. He was at the edge of Yellowstone, and he got literally blown away. Right.
It hasn't. The super volcano I think it hasn't actually erupted for, like, what is it, 600, 700,000 years or something. So there's no guarantee that thing's going to blow, because this thing's been around every 3,600 years, right?
You're right, and there is no guarantee it would blow. You're right.
Yeah.
On one hand, on the other, it's doing all the things you would expect a volcano to do before it blew, which is swarms. They're having swarms of earthquakes up there. I'd rather, quite frankly, not have to deal with it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're located up there already and you're all situated and you think you're squared away, near, you know, within the radius is 600 miles of damage for Yellowstone. By the way, that's a huge area. I would have a plan B to make good my escape and have a safe haven outside that 600-mile radius. I think that would be the wise thing to do, quite frankly.
Now, what should people do to prepare? What should they have to make sure that they can maybe survive this thing?
Well, funny you should ask that question, because I got all the answers, Michael.
I knew you did.
Yeah. Well, at my website, thelibertyman.com, I do offer some DVDs specifically related to preparedness. If you haven't been to my website for a while, Michael, you'll see some new things like thin-shelled concrete dome homes, for example, that I'm working with a couple of men who they build them, and they also offer seminars where you learn how to build one by actually building one. I'm working with Mobile Mini to get overseas shipping containers, these 20-foot and 40-foot connexes, delivered to any place in the United States you want delivered. An excellent, the best in my opinion, because I've read a bunch of them, Wilderness Survival Manual at my website, 6 ways in, 12 ways out. But getting more specific, first and foremost, spiritual preparedness. The most important survival tool is your brain. The most important aspect of that is being spiritually prepared. And looking at the experience of POWs from World War II, American POWs, we know that those who were spiritually prepared were far more likely to survive the POW experience than those that were not. After that comes skills. Now, the skills commonly found on farms and ranches are what you need. There's 2 skills, however, that are less common and very much needed. The skills of emergency medical treatment and the skills of a ham radio operator. Emergency communications is a matter of life and death, literally, and emergency medical treatment, of course, is the same. If you're in a community of 20 people or a community of 2,000 people, what the chief of police is looking for, what the sheriff's looking for, what the fire chief is looking for, is men and women who have those 2 skills, ham radio skills and emergency medical treatment skills. Otherwise, you're looking at all the skills commonly found, like I say, on farms and ranches all over the country. Planting, raising, cultivating food, harvesting it, storing it, of course, preparing it to eat. Animal husbandry, chickens, ducks, goats, cattle, horses. Common household things, like, for example, how do you do laundry when you don't have hot and cold running water at 40 pounds pressure? You know, it can start to get problematic, yeah. And it wasn't too long ago that families took 1 full day a week from sun up to sundown doing nothing but laundry continuously for 12 hours. And that's within living memory. And what I suggest people do, Michael, is get a Maytag wringer washer. If you have electricity, you can do laundry. You don't have to have hot and cold running water under 40 pounds pressure. If you don't have electricity, you can hook it up to a bicycle and still have a washing machine. It sure beats your wife. Been down at the creek, bending over some rocks. She won't like that at all. She will not be a happy camper. So yeah, doing laundry is a major thing. Preparing food when you don't have hot and cold running water. Doing the cleanup. You know, we've become so dependent on electrical and gas appliances that unless you've gone camping for more than a few days and really roughed it, you don't have a clue what it's going to be like. It's going to be tough. Going back to Little House on the Prairie without the infrastructure of Little House on the Prairie. That's probably what we're looking at.
Oh, boy.
Well, Boyd's right. Well, look at, Little House on the Prairie is a good example because it was so popular and so many people watched it. 1890s in the United States, in the West. They had a complete working infrastructure. Products were manufactured, transported, and sold. We had medical services offered to people, a postal system that worked, police services, the fire department, and goods transported long distances with steam locomotives. There was no internal combustion engines and no electricity, but all the things we have now were getting done then. So we'd go back to the 1890s without that infrastructure. All those, for the most part, that stuff's all in museums, what's left of it.
Right.
A man owning horses and wagons would be the wealthiest man in the county.
Yep, absolutely. There won't be any stuff coming from China. If you're going to have what you got, that's it.
You will have what you have. A good plan B for transportation, by the way, is the full-size folding mountain bike, the paratrooper bicycle at my website, as currently used in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's tough. It folds up into a compact package. Has full-size wheels, by the way, with no other folding mountain bike has full-size wheels but this one. It's mil-spec. It's really a tough bicycle.
That's cool.
It is.
Does it have the jet ski feature on it by any chance?
That's an option. That's an extra aftermarket option. Yeah.
Okay. So, all in all, I mean, people really need to get prepared because this thing is going to happen. I mean, we can agree that it's definitely going to happen. That something's going to happen, and
absolutely, Michael. The federal government of the United States has spent hundreds of millions of our tax dollars getting ready for this the past 31 years. And the evidence is right in front of our eyes that something very unusual is going on in terms of preparedness. Look at the seed, as in tomato seed, potato seed, garden seed. The seed vault, built partly with Bill Gates' money, up in the on an island near the Arctic Circle as part of Norway. Now, talk about logistics. How about building a major-sized steel-reinforced concrete building at the edge of the Arctic Circle in 7 months?
Yeah.
Now, think about the logistics of that. You know, you call it, you need 100 yards of 5-bag mix concrete. You call it the ready-mix plant and have it delivered? Hardly. You got to build your own ready-mix plant and bring everything in by boat. You have to build housing for your people and have meals prepared for your people. Everything has to be done on site. And to do that in 7 months, they must have been working 16-hour days at least for 7 months, maybe 24-hour days. Now, talk about expense. The cost per square foot to do that kind of construction at the edge of the Arctic Circle, oh my goodness. What are you talking, $400, $500 a square foot? I don't know.
Yeah, they didn't do it for no reason.
Well, let's get back to these FEMA camps. We kind of glossed over that. You know, in the Patriot community and Patriot Radio, alternative news, oh, the evil FEMA camps. They're going to lock up the Christians. They're going to lock up the Second Amendment people. You know, Glenn and Michael, it may not be anything more devious than the fact they're going to need them. There's going to be millions of refugees. They're going to need refugee camps. Not necessarily some sinister plot to lock up Christians. It may be nothing more complex, and there's going to be lots of refugees.
Oh, yeah, there will be. No doubt about it. The cover story, I think even their cover story was bogus. The cover story, from what I heard, was that they were originally for illegal aliens, and it's like, that's such a joke because they don't even arrest illegal aliens.
Exactly.
They want them to come here.
Exactly. Right, I know. It doesn't hold water, does not pass the laugh test. Yeah.
Now, kind of jumping off subject here a little bit, how about the oil in the Gulf? Now, with the hurricane season coming along and all this other horrible stuff that can happen, what role will that play? Should, say, we get massive hurricanes and...
Right, well, hurricanes can pick up ocean water and deposit it in the form of rain. If it's got oil mixed in, well, that could wipe out these municipal water treatment plants, which are open to the sky.
Oh, yeah.
You get oil contamination in there, gentlemen. You're going to have to drain those plants, clean them, and you can't put them back in service until you know the oil-filled rain has stopped. In the meantime, your city has to be evacuated because you got no potable water. You got no water to fight fires with. It's not safe. It's not healthy. You got to evacuate.
Yeah.
Well,
and, you know, that's it. Yeah.
I was wondering, you know, this is kind of a wild theory, but, you know, what's the possibility that this thing was intentional to ease people into the thought of, hey, you know, we've got to evacuate the coast. But the only reason I don't count that is that pretends that the government wants to actually save people and relocate them to the FEMA camps early. So
well, that would, what you're saying there, Glenn, is a bit convoluted and a bit far out on one hand. On the other, it certainly is within the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
And you know, we need to be fast on our feet here, keep all the contingencies in mind. But for you know, people living in those areas who have friends and relatives living in those areas, if I had friends and relatives in those areas, I would be making sure that I had a spare bedroom ready to accept my, you know, people I cared about who were evacuating, so they had some place to come to.
Yeah.
That'd be the right thing to do.
When do you think the first sign would be, say, Florida, South Carolina, Alabama? What would be the first sign to get out of Dodge, in your opinion?
We're already at. Well, I think we're already having it. I'm getting calls from people down there already, Michael, that are already in the process of liquidating real estate at deep discounts and getting out of Dodge. They're already at that point.
So yeah, so we're basically already at the point of no return, because obviously if a major earthquake did happen here, you're not going to just get in your car and drive out of your area.
No, that's not going to happen. No, if you got a dirt bike, you make it out, but an automobile restricted to roads, that's not going to happen. A friend of mine, I was talking on the radio about this marvelous photograph of Houston, Texas during a hurricane a couple of years ago. 14 lanes of traffic, all going one direction.
Yeah.
You know, and it was an aerial photograph, and it was in Time or Newsweek, one of those news weeklies, spread out over 2 pages. One of the most incredible photographs I've ever seen. And of course, all 14 lanes were at a dead stop, by the way.
Yeah.
But it's kind of amazing, gentlemen. You know, we're at anybody can watch the hurricane radar in real time on the internet, and it's not like, you know, 60, 70 years ago they'd been moving across the Gulf and we wouldn't know it.
Right.
At least normal people wouldn't. But despite having all this imaging and this technology, people still don't do anything until the last 24 hours.
Right.
It's amazing.
You're so right.
And we see it time and time again.
Well, I've actually been contemplating.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just say these hurricanes form off the coast of Africa, and we watch them for a week as they work their way towards us.
Right.
And then at the last minute, people want to jump in their cars and evacuate. So.
Yeah, you're so right. You know, I mean, I've seen it. I've moved to the South about 2 years ago, and since I've been here, fortunately, I haven't had to deal with anything like that. But I'm actually contemplating getting out of here very soon, and probably sooner than later, because from the sounds of things, I'm really on borrowed time here.
Yeah.
Absolutely. How close to the coast are you there, Michael?
Well, I'm in Columbia, South Carolina, so I'm about just under 2 hours away.
Okay, so that's about 100 miles. And what's your elevation above sea level?
That is a good question. I got to be honest, I'm not so positive about that. But if anybody's listening and they know,
it's kind of funny. I on a lunch break I do concealed carry training for pistols, and on a lunch break I asked one of my Navy veteran students. I said, "Can you tell me the elevation of your house?" He told me to the foot the elevation of his house. Now, there aren't many people that can do that, Michael. This guy's not from Missouri. In fact, Tim Spencer's story is kind of good in this regard. Him and his wife they're Cherokee Indians, are from Central Florida, and they were pistol students of mine also, and we're sitting there having lunch during my break at my pistol class. And his wife, very sweet lady, she says, "John, I don't like cold, I don't like snow, I don't even like Missouri. I'm here because of that darn map." And then she went on to tell me how she missed seafood, fresh seafood.
Yeah.
Okay, now, John, I'm being told that Columbia is actually 325 miles above. That's what I'm being told. I can't confirm that, but that's...
Feet.
Yeah?
Feet, not miles, feet.
Okay, so somebody wrote miles, so I'm just giving you what I'm being told, and then somebody else said that they're 872 above. So
yeah. Well, 325 is not high enough. 800
No, I
feet.
didn't think so.
800 feet's marginal. 800 feet's marginal.
John, can you say what state you're in, or you don't want to tell anybody?
I'm in Missouri. I mean, you go to my website, you know, you can find my mailing address. That's no secret.
Okay,
You know,
I didn't know.
I'm here in the Missouri Ozarks. What we call, this is considered South Central Missouri.
Yeah.
When I chose this location, I was not aware of the 10th planet. It was chosen for other reasons, but I feel very blessed that I ended up here. I've got family ties going back here for basically a little more than a century.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons I ended up in this area.
Now, I first heard about Planet X back in the early 80s. I remember some little science magazine in school that, they passed out. And there was one little article about Planet X, and it just simply said that a Russian satellite had gone out of whack or something and caught a glimpse of this thing. And then I never heard about it again after that.
Well, that's what you ran across inadvertently there in school. That was high school, I guess, Glenn?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In the early 80s, around 81, there was an article published in the New York Times and several other articles in some mainstream publications about Planet X. And I'm going to say by 83 at the latest, that was they pretty much got a lid on it, and there's been no mainstream coverage of it since. At least not in any serious manner. In 2001, 2002, there were some flippant articles that made you sound like you needed a tinfoil hat if you thought Planet X was real. But you know, and then we had a woman who claimed to talk to aliens, who claimed that in May 2003, Planet X was going to cause problems, and of course she was made a lot of fun of, and that was the end of that. So you're one of the very few people, Michael, who has any recollection of seeing those articles when they were being published 26, 27 years ago.
I was actually excited at the time because I thought, a new planet, maybe they'll find life on it. You know, I didn't know that it was a planet that was soaring through space and coming to wreck my day, you know.
Exactly. Well, they left out that part, didn't they?
Yeah, they sure did. They sure did. They actually claimed that it, just like you said, that it was 3 to 5 times the size of Earth, and that it could hold life. That was the article I read back then. And of course, I don't know how much they knew back then, but I have to assume they had quite a bit of knowledge of this thing then.
Well, what you're saying is almost a direct quote from what Harrington was saying in the same period of time. Dr. Harrington, by the way, after he gave this interview, he announced publicly he was packing up equipment and going to, I believe, New Zealand or Australia to look at this thing. And you can see in the video, he's a healthy, strong, vigorous man. But 3-4 months later, he was dead allegedly from a fast-acting form of cancer.
Yeah, is that the guy that originally was looking for it?
Yes. Yes.
And wasn't he supposed to have a press conference or something, and then by the time, he was dead already, or basically?
Exactly. And then of all things, to add irony on top of irony, NASA published a kind of a tribute obituary type thing, saying that Dr. Harrington had given up his search for Planet X and no longer believed it was real. That's serious.
Right.
But his co-worker, his astronomer, who was his the man he worked with, never said anything about Planet X publicly again. He got the message.
Well,
he got the message.
Well, again, even the Bible talks about it. They refer to it as wormwood, if I'm right. And so there's plenty of evidence of this thing, and that it's been around before, and that it's right about the time that it's coming back. So, it's a scary thought, John. It really is.
Well, it is, and we touched on this earlier, but human beings living on this planet, one of the things they want to do, Michael and Glenn, is keep from us our real history as human beings living on this planet. The farther, what you need to have advanced civilization is 2 things. You need knowledge of advanced mathematics and a well-structured written language. Now you go back, you hear about the Mayans a lot. Mayans had mathematical calculations to 10 decimal points. They did. The farther back you go in these cultures, the more sophisticated mathematics, engineering, and language you find. It's just the opposite of what we're told we should be finding, which is less sophisticated mathematics, less sophisticated written languages if they exist at all. In fact, I need to mention a couple of things here.
Okay.
Glenn, if you were to go to Saudi Arabia tomorrow morning, there's a portion of Saudi Arabia where there's hundreds of acres of green glass covering the ground.
Right.
Now, up until August 1945, no scientist could figure out how can you get sand in the Saudi Arabian desert over that vast area to be 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
In August 1945, everybody found out. It's called nuclear weapons. And Michael, if you were to go to that disputed piece of real estate between India and Pakistan called Kashmir tomorrow morning with the correct instrumentation, you could find where nuclear devices were set off there about 12,000 years ago.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that, because I had a guest on here about this lost continent of Atlantis, and he talked of that very thing.
Well, that's true, and that's science. That's real science. But, drum roll please, there's the Black Knight satellite. The Sputnik went up in 1959 about the size of a grapefruit, our satellite about the size of a basketball a few months later. Optical and radar tracking stations were set up to watch these new man-made satellites. And guess what, gentlemen? They found there was a satellite already up there, not on an equatorial orbit like Sputnik and ours, but on a polar orbit, which we've only been able to do for about 20 years. And they call this object the Black Knight satellite. I know for a fact, because I verified it independently, that every U.S. senator knows that the Black Knight satellite exists. I know two of its three dimensions, 40 feet by 70 feet. I know its other nickname. It's called the cryogenic box. I know that once they found this thing, it became a matter of highest national priority to gain access to it, recover the technology, and reverse engineer it for their own purposes. And I have no doubt that they've done so, and they probably did so decades ago. It's 12,000 miles high. Excuse me, it's 20,000 miles high, just below the Van Allen radiation belt, and it's estimated to be about 12,000 years old.
Wow, I didn't ever hear that.
Well, this is why you keep hearing, there's a book that it's mentioned in the first page of the first paragraph, Dead Men's Secrets by Jonathan Gray. Dead Men's Secrets, the author is Jonathan Gray, an archaeologist from New Zealand. I've interviewed him on my show a couple of times. This thing is real, and every U.S. senator knows about this thing. They may not know a lot of details because it's so highly compartmentalized, it's almost beyond belief. But it was probably the earliest we could have got up that high would have been the late 60s during the Apollo space mission. We probably had enough lift capability to get 20,000 miles high, and start analyzing this thing. You know, you get up there, you measure the door and the locking mechanism. You come back down, you build a matching locking mechanism to match up with the existing one. You get back up there. Who wants to be the first one through the door, gentlemen? Not me. Whoa, baby.
No, me neither.
No, this is real. And there's a blackout on that. You do a Google search on the Black Knight satellite, you're not going to find much. I recommend Jonathan Gray's work. He's an excellent archaeologist. He has published a number of books. He makes a great guest, by the way, if you want to try to get Jonathan Gray. BeforeUs.com is his website. Quite the gentleman, well-spoken, and will be an excellent guest talking about ancient technology on this planet. Not aliens, just plain old human beings. That's one of the things about this gentleman, is the cyclical nature of human beings rising to high levels of civilization and being smacked down to the mud by the 10th planet. We've been through this before. We're about to go through it again.
You know, I've even heard that they found stuff on the moon that actually, of course, they're not going to tell us about it, but I've heard through the grapevine that they found technologies on the moon that prove that human beings have been there before. You know,
very likely.
Maybe 12,000 years ago, yes.
Very likely. Well, if they could get something that big, 20,000 miles high, of course they could go to the moon. Yeah. That's a given. Of course they could go to the moon. You know, we don't have the ability right now to get a single object that large up. We have to bring it up in pieces and bolt it together. You know, the cargo space of the space shuttle will hold something about the size of a small school bus, but nothing that large. So, of course, if they had that kind of engineering to get something that big, that high, of course they could go to the moon. It would be a piece of cake for them.
You know, I've often thought... Oh, go ahead, Glenn.
Oh, I was just going to say that just kind of depresses you in a way, because think about it. If they had that kind of technology, they could have had, you know, spacecraft. They could have had Mars and moon bases, and basically, as far as we know, none of them made it.
Well, that's right. Another bit to all this. The German government in the 1930s sent scientists to India to study the ancient Sanskrit writings concerning nuclear matters, nuclear material, building nuclear devices. You know, the Sanskrit writings go back thousands of years.
Yeah.
But they, you know, these people weren't joking around. These German scientists are very serious people, and they weren't going there on holiday, especially to a godforsaken third world country that smells like urine, which is what India is. Well, it is, you know. But they went there for the knowledge. They went there for the knowledge to find out and get a head start on building nuclear weapons and nuclear plants and using nuclear power and so forth. And the Sanskrit writings was one of the places they went to gain this knowledge.
That's what upsets me the most is all the secrecy. You know, it's like all our history is hidden from us. It just feels like you're just living in a big game, you know, and it's like just so upsetting.
The Matrix.
Yeah,
we're living in the Matrix.
And it's like, you know, how are we ever going to progress? I mean, it's like you just get these little priest classes.
Well, it's one of the fundamental things. If you want to control people, you cut them off from their culture and their history. We did this with the American Indians.
Right.
We took these Indian children and we put them in schools, and they were not allowed to know, well, first of all, they weren't allowed to speak their language. Cut them off from their language. They weren't allowed to know their own history and their own culture of their own people. And they're doing that to all of us. They didn't just do it to the Indians. They're doing it to all of us. We're cut off from who we are as human beings living on this planet. And that's very important to control us. You know, if we really knew our true power, what we have as human beings, what we're capable of, the powers that be would be out of business in a heartbeat.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I couldn't agree with you more. And, you know, it is, like Glenn said, it's a shame that all this is kept from us. You know, just so much technology that could be so beneficial to mankind, and they hide it and save it for themselves. And instead they put all kinds of contaminants in our food and the stuff that we insert into our bodies. And it's just a shame that they get away with all this. It really is. And I'm glad that there's guys like you out there, John, who do the research and get the answers out. And if people don't believe it, I wanted to bring that up as well. John, you had, on your video, you had mentioned certain Google searches that people can do. And
I do. Let's run through those. Yeah, let's run through those real quick so people can prove it to themselves. First of all, first Google search, CIA and the word Denver. And you'll find where the CIA's moved from Langley, Virginia, 85 feet above sea level to the mile-high city. NSA, as in National Security Agency, and the word Denver. NSA and the word Utah. NSA and the words Augusta, Georgia. They're relocating to all these places well above sea level, well away from the coast. EPA and the word libraries, plural. And you'll find where they're shutting down the EPA libraries. Vatican Library, we talked about this earlier, another Google search. Plum Island and the word Kansas. Yes, they are moving the Plum Island Animal Research Facility to Kansas. That should be enough to get people started. And my DVD, Global Warming, What the Government Isn't Telling You, I do have a toll-free order line 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's 800-592-9543. I say again, 800-592-9543. And, of course, my website is thelibertyman.com. I started a new radio show, gentlemen. I now have 8 radio shows on 4 different networks, 6 days a week.
You're busy.
Yeah. My new show is Thursday afternoons from 5 to 6 Central on shortwave, WWCR, and WWCR.com on the Internet as well. It's airtime I'm paying for. I'm just before Professor McCanning. And so I found out the time slot was coming open. He told me about it. So I went ahead and grabbed it. And so we now have 2 hours back-to-back of Professor McCanning and myself every Thursday afternoon from 5 to 7 p.m. Central Time.
And I want to tell everybody who's listening that I have seen John's video. I actually have it here in my collection, and it's definitely worth getting your hands on because there's far more information in that CD than we can ever put out in 2 hours here on this show. But go ahead, Glenn.
I was just going to ask you, John, have you ever heard from the back channels or anything? We like what you're doing, you know, or we don't like what you're doing, or has it just been? Have you been have they kind of kept away from?
So far they're leaving me alone.
Yeah.
The insiders that I know, they have pensions that they don't want to put at risk.
Right.
Many of them would say the things that I'm saying if they did not have a pension to be at risk. So that they're grateful that somebody's doing it because they can't. They're not going to jeopardize their family's well-being by talking about this stuff, and I can't blame them. You know, they worked 20 years to get their pension, and they deserve that, and they're not going to risk it by helping people who basically don't want to pay attention, and anyway, which most of the public doesn't want to hear this message. Even my own family, they think Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have plenty of friends and family who think that I'm crazy or just a conspiracy theorist. And, all you can do is warn people and let them do the research themselves. But I warn them that they're going to research it. They better get started because this thing is real. It really is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the right thing to do is to warn people and don't get emotionally attached to the outcome, gentlemen. If you get emotionally attached to the outcome, it'll just make you crazy.
Yeah.
So, my paper I wrote, my video was based on a paper I wrote in 05, originally, No Need for Panic, originally written for my brother and my brother-in-law and their families. And I knew full well that they would not pay heed, but I also knew it was the right thing to do, and I had to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, how much of your family actually is awake to what's going on, just out of curiosity, because, it's taken a long time to break through even just part of my family.
Right. Well, that's typical in most families, and that's the expected thing. It's a blessing when both spouses are on the same page with this material. Sometimes it happens. Many times it does not. But it's a real blessing when both a man and a wife are both on the same page about this topic and this matter.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, we're just about out of time. John, I want to thank you so much for coming back on the show and in such short notice, too. I just wanted to get this message out.
Well, thank you, Michael, and I'm glad I could do it. And Lynn, thank you for being with us also. And why don't you put me down on your calendar? We'll do this again maybe in 2 or 3 months.
Okay, sounds like a date to me, John. I can't wait to do this again. All right, well, you have a great night, and thank you once more.
Thank you. You do the same. Gentlemen, have a good evening and good night.
Okay, good night. All right, everyone, that was John Moore, and he had, this is real information he's given us. He's definitely no kook, and neither are we. So, Glenn, what'd you think?
Awesome show. I really, I was going to say I enjoyed it, but you never enjoy hearing this kind of stuff. But it was interesting information, and, he's very knowledgeable, obviously has a lot of sources and so forth. So how about you?
Me, well, I knew that his information would be not so, I hate to use the word enjoyable, but it's just good to get somebody on with the facts, and he's been on the show a couple times before, and I'll tell you, he's a great man to talk to, and after last week, I love Dr. Rand, but we really didn't get into the Planet X thing as I thought we would, so I thought I owed it to my listeners to touch the subject one more time. So,
Yeah,
and that's what I said.
I knew it was going to be, you know, since we're on at a different time, what I thought is I would definitely make sure that everybody gets a hold of the archives on this show for the people that weren't aware that we were going to be on tonight. So I'll make sure that we get a lot of people to listen to this show because it was a really good one.
Yeah, it definitely was, Glenn. And Glenn, I can't wait to have you back. You're going to be back with us on Saturday. And actually, I was hoping you'd join me for 3 hours on Saturday.
Sure. Who do we got up with them this Saturday?
Saturday we have Peco. Peco, I don't have his last name in front of me. Peco, and he's going to come on about the man prophecy. So we're going to be hitting on 2012 just a little more.
Okay, great.
So,
great. Do we have any time left, or are we almost out of time?
We're definitely out of time, but if you want to give your website really quick, I would appreciate that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to talk about some other things, but we'll hold that for Saturday. But yeah, the website is Project InSearch. That's www.project.insearch.com. We've got a community of like-minded people. So if you feel like you're ostracized by your families and you're into all this kind of stuff that we talk about, we'd love to have you join our community. We've got about 2,500 members total. We've always got somebody online just about 24/7 just about. So come over there, chat, meet people. It's a great way to expand your knowledge and meet a lot of cool people.
All right, Glenn. Well, thank you so much, and looking forward to having you back on Saturday. And I want to thank you for joining us tonight with John Moore.
Attention to the scientists, and I know some, and I listen to them, and I read what they write, and I also know because I've read what happened when this cycle went through. We went through this cycle 3,600 years ago, and that's why I was able to say with some certainty what would be happening in the future, 2 years in the future. Now, the federal government, gentlemen, has something called continuity of government contingency planning. It goes back to the Eisenhower administration in the Cold War days. Originally set up, obviously, to deal with nuclear war. But beginning in 1979, they changed course, and they were planning for the events that we're about to deal with in great sincerity with what we generally call earth changes, which is abrupt climate change and rising ocean levels and seismic activity and volcanism, all kind of mixed into one kind of haphazard package. The original completion date, gentlemen, for them to be ready for all these events was December this year, 2010. About 5 years ago, they redid their calculations, and they discovered, oh my goodness, we don't have until December 2010. We need to move it one full calendar year closer to us in time to December 2009, which is what they did. And of course, they continue to make plans and do things. In fact, Michael, I think since the last time we've talked, we've found a couple of fascinating new tidbits. For example, in the summer of 2007, NASA, never a straight answer, National Aeronautic and Space Administration, they granted a $74 million contract to a Prudential subsidiary called Prudential Relocation, $74 million two-year contract to relocate NASA employees, ending in September 2009, renewable in one-year increments. Well, one of my research associates, Mr. Sheldon Day, I asked him to submit a FOIA request to get contract specifications on that contract, Freedom of Information Act request. Well, to make a long story short, by the time the government was done and by the time Prudential Relocation was done redacting, which is a polite way of saying censoring, all we had was a sheet of paper, a couple of sheets of paper with mostly blacked out words. You really couldn't make heads or tails of it. What we were looking for was two things, actually three things. How many people were being relocated? where they're being relocated from, and where they're being relocated to. Now, where they're being relocated from, well, you don't have to guess about that because there aren't many options, and they're all fairly close to oceans. Kennedy Space Center, Huntsville, Alabama, and Houston, Texas. That's pretty well known and not a secret. What we don't know is where they're going to. Truth and Consequences, Mexico is one place NASA owns, but we don't know how big it is or if it can accept those people. Or maybe they're going to Denver, like the CIA and NSA.
Right.
So there's some unknowns there. Anyway, we also learned this past fall that NASA is building a massive computer center 20 miles south of Salt Lake City, out in the desert. And I've been 20 miles south of Salt Lake City, gentlemen, and it really is the desert. They have sandstorm. I was in a sandstorm. I had to walk backwards at about a 55-degree angle so I could walk and keep the sand out of my nose and mouth and eyes. Anyway, yeah, that's the desert. Now they're moving from Fort Meade, Maryland, of course, and here's the publicly stated reason. May make sense if you don't know how the national power grid works, but they say the local power grid can no longer provide enough electricity for the 20 acres of Cray mainframe computers underground at Fort Meade, Maryland, which is kind of laughable because most of us know that the power grid is no longer local. It's nationwide in scope, and the power grid in Maryland can buy electricity from Texas or New York or any place there's electricity to be bought. So that's obviously a fraud being perpetrated there, and it's obviously they're moving these people and all this equipment for no reason that makes any sense publicly.
Well, it might make a little sense, at least to them.
Well, it does, and it's
yeah.
very disruptive. You know, these men and women who work there at Fort Meade, they have families, friends, all their connections, children going to school. It's incredibly disruptive to move people 2,000 miles away from everything they know and want to be around. And it's nothing to be taken lightly.
So they've been planning. Oh, go ahead, Glenn.
I was just wondering if they even have facilities for that many, schools and everything else that they would need to relocate that many families.
Well, they're going to do it, and whatever infrastructure is there, the local community will have to deal with it. Probably public schools will. I've seen this before. They'll bring in portable buildings to house extra students. They'll do whatever they need to do. Because they have a mandate to accept all students that live in the district. That's, of course, the case any place in the country. I got some more information about the Plum Island Animal Research Facility. Michael, I think we talked about that the last time.
Yes, sir.
Well, we have new listeners. This is radio, of course. Now, Glenn, if you and I were going to study and work with really fun stuff like foot-and-mouth disease and anthrax, wouldn't we put it on an island in the Atlantic Ocean? Would that be a smart thing to do you think?
You definitely want it away from as many people as you can, for sure.
And away from agriculture. Well, that's what they did. They've got Plum Island off the coast of New York up there, and they've had, for about 50 years, they've been studying those very deadly diseases and organisms up there in Plum Island, which is about 200 acres. Now, you can do a Google image search. You can find Plum Island.
What if you learned that everything that scientists have been saying about global warming is a lie? That's what my guest, John Moore, is saying, and what's more, he can prove it. A homicide detective and private investigator since 1973, Detective Moore was previously an intelligence analyst for the United States military. Using his combined skills and experience, he managed to track down and debrief witnesses to several U.S. Navy classified briefings regarding global warming. With shocking results, he'll explain how the government has known about climate change for decades and that Al Gore's message of stopping global warming has come 30 years too late. He'll tell us about the government cover-up, how he managed to discover this information, where the safe haven for rising ocean levels and climate change is, plus much, much more as we discuss the arrival of Planet X. As John Moore returns to Late Night in the Midlands, answers your questions, so please get ready to call in at 347-989-1012. Again, that is 347-989-1012. And everybody, please welcome my guest once again here on Late Night in the Midlands, Mr. John Moore. Thank you so much for being a guest here on Late Night in the Midlands, John. How are you tonight?
Thank you, Michael. It's very good to be with you again. How long has it been since we visited? About 6 months, isn't it? Around December or so?
Yes, sir, it has been. And Glenn Kennedy, you're with us as well. I just want to let you know my co-host tonight is Glenn Kennedy. So good evening to you too, Glenn.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi.
Well,
okay, yeah, it's been a while, John. It sure has.
Well, let's get this off to a running start here.
Okay.
Now, Glenn, have you had the opportunity to see my DVD, Global Warming, What the Government Isn't Telling You?
No, I have not. This is
okay.
a new subject
well,
for me.
Michael's holding out on you. He needs to get you a copy to watch it. That was recorded in front of a live audience in April '08. I had a conversation last night with a young man who's got I forget if it's a bachelor's or a master's in physics, very bright young man. And he says, John, what you said would happen in 2 years in the future, which was April '08, which would be 2 years in the future would be now. He says those things are now happening. And what I said, Glenn, that would happen 2 years in the future would be increased number and severity of seismic events, increased number and severity of volcanism, which, of course, we're seeing dramatic increases in both, aren't we?
That's right.
Yeah, right. Now, I'm no prophet. I don't have a crystal ball. And I'm no scientist. I'm a homicide detective. But I paid aerial photos and topographical maps in about 0.3 of a second on Google Image. You know, and here's the publicly stated reason why they're moving it to, guess what, Kansas, you know, the most productive agricultural real estate on the planet. They say, quote unquote, we're running out of space on Plum Island. Well, do your Google image search of Plum Island, and you'll see a few little black dots in amongst about 200 acres of real estate on that island. There is no shortage of real estate there, gentlemen. They could triple or quadruple the amount of buildings on Plum Island and still have enough space for 2 or 3 golf courses.
Amazing.
Well, it is, and it's right in plain sight. And that's one of the, Michael will remember this. I go into some detail in my DVD about hiding things in plain sight.
Oh, yes.
This is a prime example of that, gentlemen, because most people won't go the trouble of questioning it. They'll just accept it as fact. Oh, they're running out of space on Plum Island. It must be some small spot, not enough space. And, well, that's a good thing. They need more space. Until you look at the aerial photographs. And then it just blows their whole story out of the water. The EPA still has all 4 of their libraries closed down, by the way, gentlemen. And when they did this in the summer of '07, I think it was, it caused the scientists who work there to file grievances. It's sort of like suing your employer, Glenn, you know, not really career enhancing, filing grievances against the people who write your paycheck. Well, that's what well, God bless them. You know, these men and women, these scientists, they did the right thing. And they said, gentlemen, you've cut us off from the basic research material we need to keep America safe. The EPA responded, well, we closed all 4 of these libraries as a cost savings measure. And then, God bless them, the GSA, the government, or GAO, excuse me, Government Accountability Office, they come along and say, no, gentlemen, it costs more to close these 4 libraries than to keep them open. Yes, this is a deep hole of convoluted cover stories.
Right.
Cover stories on top of cover stories. I had out somebody sent me a map a couple of years ago showing all the FEMA camps circled all over the United States. I was pulling out looking at it, and I thought, oh, I hadn't thought about it before, but out of the dozens and dozens of FEMA camps, There's maybe 5 or 6 that are close to a major body of water, the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf Coast, or the West Coast. And I thought, well, of course this fits. They know what's coming. They're not going to build FEMA camps that are going to be underwater, so they put them away from the coastlines.
Absolutely.
You're speechless, gentlemen.
Yeah, absolutely, because
not good for a radio talk show host.
No, not good at all.
Well, one of the things I'm finding out, I'm starting to emphasize this more and more, is the cyclical nature of this event that we're at the beginning of, and most important of all, drum roll please, the cyclical nature of human beings living on this planet. There's been a lot of attention, I think intentionally so, about, say for example, that claims that UFOs with alien beings came to this planet and gave us our civilization, or helped build the pyramids, or some silly stuff like that. I think the reason those stories are promoted and given attention is to keep the theory of evolution alive, because according to the theory of evolution, once you go back, say 50,000 years or 100,000 years, our ancestors would have been knuckle-dragging primitive people without speech, certainly without written language, when the facts prove exactly the opposite. When you get into a study called forbidden archaeology or hidden archaeology, you start running across artifacts that would, and do, in fact, throw Darwin's theory of evolution standard on its head. Human footprints in the same fossilized mud as dinosaur footprints, for example. Or how about a human shoe print in solid rock? And the mainstream scientists will say, oh, it's nature creating a artifact that looks like a man-made object, until you take a 10-power jeweler's loupe and look carefully at the footprint, the shoe print in solid rock, and you can see the threads and the stitching.
Now, do you think that they're going to actually get away with this cover-up for very much longer? I mean, I can't see where that eventually we're going to be able to see this object in the sky, aren't we? And
well, we will, Michael. We will, Michael. And by the time we can see it, this whole planet's going. We think it's rocking and rolling now. It'll be rocking and rolling to a point where, yes, many millions of people will know what they're looking at and what this thing means. But by then, it will be way too late to do very much of any consequence in terms of escape from low-lying areas and really having safe havens that have food and medical supplies and so forth. We'll be down to the final few weeks, if not few months by then.
We have had several earthquakes around the world as it is, and and then the volcanoes and so many other things. I mean, sinkholes, giant sinkholes at that. And I kind of wonder if that doesn't have something to do with all this.
Well, I was talking to one of my research associates today about the sinkhole in Guatemala City. That's not necessarily related. Apparently, Guatemala City was built on volcanic ash, which is very subject to